January 17, 1945. A makeshift field hospital, 30 miles south of Manila, Luzon. The canvas tent walls shuddered against the Pacific wind, carrying with it the smell of disinfectant, blood, and tropical rain. Inside, beneath swaying surgical lamps powered by a stuttering generator, a young Japanese corporal lay on a metal cot, his left leg shattered by American artillery. His eyes remained fixed on the tent ceiling, watching shadows dance across the khaki fabric. He had not eaten in 4 days. He had not spoken in 6. In his mind, he was already dead, because that was what every soldier of the Imperial Japanese Army had been taught to become the moment enemy hands pulled him from the battlefield. The corporal's name was Takeshi Yamamoto, though no American would learn it for another 3 days. He was 19 years old. He had been conscripted in Hokkaido in 1943, trained in the doctrine of Bushido, and told that surrender was a betrayal not only of the emperor but of his ancestors, his village, and the very concept of Japanese honor. The military field manual distributed to every soldier in the Imperial Army was explicit. Capture meant eternal disgrace. Death was preferable. Death was noble. To fall into enemy hands was to become something less than human, a creature stripped of honor, unworthy of return, condemned to wander as a ghost even after physical death. This was not metaphor. This was doctrine. This was the architecture of a national psychology built on 15 years of militaristic indoctrination, reaching back to the early 1930s, when the Japanese education system had been restructured to emphasize absolute obedience, self-sacrifice, and the divinity of the emperor. But now Corporal Yamamoto lay on an American cot, breathing American air, surrounded by American voices, and he did not understand why he was still alive. The last thing he remembered before unconsciousness was the concussion of the shell blast, the sensation of flying backward through smoke, and then the hands, white hands, large hands, lifting him from the mud. He had expected a bullet. He had expected a bayonet. He had expected anything except what came next: bandages, plasma, morphine. And then, impossibly, a woman's voice speaking in soft, careful tones, asking him in broken Japanese if he could hear her, if he understood, if he was in pain. The woman was Lieutenant Sarah Brennan, 26 years old, a graduate of Boston General Hospital's nursing program, assigned to the 142nd Field Hospital Unit since October 1944. She had treated 17 Japanese prisoners in the previous 2 months. Corporal Yamamoto was the 18th. She had learned early that Japanese POWs presented a unique challenge, not because they were hostile, but because they were often catatonic with shame, refusing food, refusing water, refusing to acknowledge their own survival. Some tried to reopen their wounds. Others simply turned their faces to the wall and waited for death. Lieutenant Brennan had seen 3 prisoners die not from their injuries, but from what the doctors called psychological collapse, a clinical term for men who had lost the will to live because survival itself had become unbearable. The American military had not been prepared for this. In early 1942, when the war in the Pacific began, U.S. intelligence officers assumed that Japanese prisoners would behave like German or Italian POWs, cooperative, pragmatic, willing to exchange information for better treatment. But the first Japanese prisoners captured at Guadalcanal and Tarawa told a different story. They did not cooperate. They did not speak. Some attempted suicide with whatever means available: broken glass, torn fabric, their own fists against concrete walls. American interrogators were baffled. American doctors were disturbed. And American nurses, many of whom had trained in the humane treatment protocols established by the Geneva Convention, found themselves confronting men who believed that humane treatment was itself a form of psychological torture, a prolonging of the unbearable. Lieutenant Brennan did not have a manual for this. No one did. What she had was instinct, experience, and a stubborn belief that every human being, regardless of uniform, deserved dignity. She had grown up in a working-class Irish neighborhood in South Boston, the daughter of a longshoreman and a seamstress. She had seen hardship. She had seen men broken by the depression, by alcohol, by despair. She recognized the look in Corporal Yamamoto's eyes, not hatred but hopelessness. And so she did what no Japanese soldier had been conditioned to expect. She treated him not as an enemy, not as a prisoner, not as a disgrace, but as a patient. She checked his pulse. She adjusted his IV drip. She cleaned the surgical site on his leg with iodine and gauze, her movements efficient and unhurried. She spoke to him in English, knowing he likely did not understand, but speaking anyway because silence, she had learned, was worse than incomprehension. "You're going to be all right," she said, her voice low and steady. "The surgery went well. You'll keep the leg. You'll heal." She did not smile. Smiling, she had been told, could be misinterpreted as mockery. But her tone carried something that transcended language: assurance, calm, the unspoken message that he was safe, that no one here would harm him, that whatever he had been taught about American cruelty was, in this tent at this moment, untrue. Corporal Yamamoto did not respond, but his eyes shifted, just slightly, from the ceiling to her face. It was the first voluntary movement he had made since regaining consciousness. To understand the shock that Japanese prisoners experienced in American medical care, one must first understand what they had been taught to expect. The indoctrination of the Imperial Japanese Army was not subtle. It was comprehensive, relentless, and began long before enlistment. In Japanese schools throughout the 1930s and early 1940s, children were taught that the emperor was a living god, that Japan's expansion across Asia was a divine mission, and that the Western powers, particularly the United States, were decadent, materialistic, and fundamentally barbaric. American soldiers, Japanese propaganda claimed, were cowards who relied on machines rather than spirit. They were undisciplined, racially impure, and culturally inferior. More importantly, they were cruel. Japanese training films depicted American soldiers executing prisoners, mutilating corpses, and desecrating the dead. These were not fringe beliefs. They were official doctrine, reinforced through military training, newsreels, and government-controlled media. The result was predictable. Japanese soldiers went into battle believing that capture meant torture and death. This belief was so deeply ingrained that surrender became statistically rare. In the Battle of Saipan in June and July 1944, of the approximately 30,000 Japanese soldiers defending the island, fewer than 1,000 were taken prisoner. The rest died in combat or committed suicide. Entire families of Japanese civilians on Saipan threw themselves from cliffs rather than face capture by American forces. This was not fanaticism in the conventional sense. It was the logical outcome of a belief system in which the enemy was not merely an opponent but a demonic force, and capture was not merely defeat but annihilation of the soul. American military planners struggled to adapt. Early in the war, psychological operations were crude and ineffective. Leaflets dropped over Japanese positions, offering safe surrender and good treatment, were largely ignored. Japanese soldiers who did surrender, often because they were unconscious or too wounded to resist, frequently attempted suicide in captivity. The U.S. military established special POW camps with Japanese-speaking interrogators, psychiatric staff, and carefully controlled environments designed to prevent self-harm. But even in these controlled settings, the psychological barrier was immense. Japanese prisoners often refused to believe they were being treated according to the Geneva Convention. Some thought it was a trick, a prelude to execution. Others simply could not reconcile the reality of their treatment with everything they had been taught. The nurses were the first to break through, not because they had special training, most did not, but because their presence alone contradicted Japanese propaganda. The Imperial Army had told its soldiers that Americans were barbaric. Barbaric nations did not send women to care for enemy wounded. Barbaric nations did not waste resources on prisoners. Barbaric nations did not administer morphine, change bandages 3 times daily, or spend hours monitoring vital signs. The cognitive dissonance was profound. For many Japanese prisoners, the kindness of American nurses was more destabilizing than any interrogation, more disorienting than any propaganda film shown in reverse. It was evidence that could not be dismissed, could not be rationalized away. It was the crack in the wall of indoctrination. Corporal Yamamoto received his first meal on the second day. It arrived on a metal tray carried by a young corpsman, a farm boy from Iowa with sunburned arms and a face still marked by teenage acne. The meal consisted of scrambled powdered eggs, 2 slices of white bread with margarine, a small portion of canned peaches, and coffee. To an American soldier, this was unremarkable, standard field rations, nothing special. To Corporal Yamamoto, it was incomprehensible. He had not eaten a full meal in weeks. In the final days before his capture, his unit had subsisted on handfuls of rice, roots dug from the jungle floor, and occasionally the flesh of pack animals too exhausted to continue. Malnutrition was endemic among Japanese forces in the Philippines by early 1945. Supply lines had collapsed. Reinforcements had been cut off. Soldiers starved in the jungle while American supply planes flew overhead, dropping crates of food, ammunition, and medical supplies to advancing Allied units. The contrast was stark and demoralizing. The Japanese army was disintegrating from within, while the American war machine seemed inexhaustible. Now staring at the tray of food, Corporal Yamamoto faced a dilemma. Japanese military doctrine held that accepting food from the enemy was a form of collaboration, a betrayal. But Japanese military doctrine had also promised that Americans would not feed prisoners at all. They would shoot them or starve them. The food was real. He could smell it. His stomach contracted with hunger so sharp it bordered on pain. And yet, to eat felt like an admission of something he could not yet articulate. That he had been lied to, that his sacrifice had been based on falsehoods, that the narrative which had defined his entire adult life was, at least in part, propaganda. Lieutenant Brennan watched from across the tent. She had seen this before, the paralysis, the internal struggle. She walked over slowly, her boots soft against the dirt floor, and knelt beside his cot. She picked up the spoon, dipped it into the eggs, and held it toward him. She did not force it. She did not speak. She simply waited. The gesture was maternal, almost instinctive, though she was only 7 years older than the corporal. In that moment, she was not an officer of the U.S. Army Nurse Corps. She was a woman offering food to a starving boy. Corporal Yamamoto took the spoon. His hand shook. He brought the eggs to his mouth and swallowed. The taste was bland, faintly metallic from the powdered mixture, but it was warm. He took another bite, then another. Lieutenant Brennan set the tray on his lap and stepped back, giving him privacy. She did not watch him eat. This, too, was intuitive. She understood that to be observed in such a moment of vulnerability would be unbearable. When she returned 20 minutes later, the tray was empty. The corporal had eaten everything, including the peach syrup. Over the following days, a routine developed. Lieutenant Brennan checked on Corporal Yamamoto every 4 hours. She changed his bandages, monitored his temperature, adjusted his medication. She brought him books in English. He could not read them, but he looked at the pictures. And once she brought him a small radio. It was tuned to an armed forces station playing Glenn Miller and Benny Goodman. Corporal Yamamoto had never heard American jazz. The sound was alien, chaotic, improvisational in a way that Japanese military music was not. Japanese martial songs were rigid, hierarchical, designed to reinforce unity and obedience. This music was the opposite, individual instruments breaking away, soloing, returning to the group. It was, though he did not yet have the framework to understand it, the sound of democracy. The sound of a society that valued individual expression within collective effort. The sound of abundance, of leisure, of a nation that could afford to produce music for entertainment rather than indoctrination. Lieutenant Brennan never asked Corporal Yamamoto about military intelligence. She never pressed him to speak. She treated him exactly as she treated the American soldiers in the adjacent tents, with competence, with care, with the fundamental assumption that his life had value. This assumption was itself revolutionary. In the world Corporal Yamamoto had known, Life had value only insofar as it served the emperor. Individual survival was irrelevant. The collective was everything. But here, in this American field hospital, his individual survival seemed to matter to people who had no reason to care, who gained nothing from his recovery, who were in fact expending valuable resources, medicine, food, time, to keep him alive. By the end of the first week, Corporal Yamamoto began to speak, not in full sentences but in fragmented words. Water, thank you, pain. Lieutenant Brennan responded in kind, her Japanese improving through repetition. She learned that he was from a fishing village, that he had a younger sister, that he had been studying to become a teacher before the war. These details emerged slowly, cautiously, like objects pulled from deep water. Each revelation was a small act of trust, a tentative acknowledgement that perhaps he was still, in some way, human. The transformation of Japanese prisoners in American custody was documented extensively by military psychiatrists assigned to POW camps throughout the Pacific Theater. Their reports, many of which were classified until the 1970s, reveal a consistent pattern. Initial capture produced extreme psychological distress, depression, dissociation, and in some cases, psychosis. Prisoners who had fully internalized the shame of surrender often exhibited symptoms resembling what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder, flashbacks, nightmares, hypervigilance, and an inability to accept their own survival. But over time, exposure to humane treatment produced a cognitive shift. The dissonance between expectation and reality became impossible to ignore. And for many prisoners, the kindness of American medical personnel, particularly nurses, became the catalyst for ideological reassessment. One psychiatric report from March 1945, filed by Captain Eugene Hoffman of the 98th General Hospital in Leyte, described a prisoner named Hiroshi Nakamura who had attempted suicide 3 times in the first 48 hours of captivity. After each attempt, he was resuscitated, treated, and placed under observation. He refused to eat. He refused to speak. He lay in his cot with his face turned toward the wall, waiting for death. It was a nurse, Captain Hoffman did not record her name, who broke through. She sat beside Nakamura's cot for 3 hours, not speaking, simply present. On the second day, she brought him tea. On the third day, she showed him a photograph of her family. On the fourth day, Nakamura asked in halting English why the Americans had not killed him. The nurse's response, as recorded by Captain Hoffman, was simple: because you're a human being and human beings deserve care. Nakamura began eating the next day. Within 2 weeks, he was cooperative, even helpful, assisting nurses with basic tasks like folding bandages and organizing medical supplies. He later told interrogators that the nurse's kindness had destroyed his understanding of the world. This was not an isolated case. By mid-1945, American POW camps across the Pacific reported similar patterns. Japanese prisoners who had spent weeks or months in captivity began to question the narratives they had been taught. Some requested books, newspapers, and information about American society. Others expressed confusion about why the United States, if it was truly winning the war, would spend resources caring for enemy wounded. The answer, they gradually learned, was embedded in American values, or at least in the idealized version of American values that the military promoted. The Geneva Convention was not merely a strategic tool. It was a reflection of a worldview in which individual rights, human dignity, and the rule of law were paramount. Japanese prisoners were not being treated humanely because it was tactically advantageous, though it sometimes was, but because the foundational ideology of American democracy held that all people possessed inherent worth. This message was reinforced in unexpected ways. In POW camps, Japanese prisoners were given access to Red Cross packages, recreational activities, and even limited self-governance. They formed committees, organized cultural events, and in some camps published newsletters. They were paid for labor in accordance with international law. They received mail from home, when possible, and were allowed to write letters back. These were not privileges, they were rights, guaranteed by treaty and enforced by military regulation. But to men who had been raised in a society where rights were subordinate to duty, where individual needs were always secondary to collective obligation, this framework was deeply strange. It was also, for many, deeply appealing. The abundance of American society played a crucial role in this ideological shift. Japanese prisoners in American custody ate better than Japanese soldiers in active combat. They had access to medical care that most Japanese civilians could not afford. They wore clean clothes, slept in dry barracks, and were protected from violence and abuse. This was not propaganda, it was material reality. And material reality, as any soldier knows, has a persuasive power that rhetoric cannot match. The Imperial Japanese government had told its people that Americans were weak, decadent, and on the verge of collapse. Japanese prisoners saw the opposite, a nation with such overwhelming industrial capacity that it could afford to feed, clothe, and care for tens of thousands of enemy prisoners, while simultaneously waging a two-front war across the Pacific and Europe. The symbolic power of this abundance cannot be overstated. Food, in particular, became a recurring motif in prisoner testimonies. One Japanese POW, interviewed by American intelligence officers in August 1945, described his first meal in captivity as a spiritual crisis. He had expected rice, perhaps, or scraps. Instead, he was given meat, vegetables, bread, and fruit. He had not seen fruit in over a year. The meal, he said, made me question everything I had been taught about America. Another prisoner captured on Okinawa told interrogators that the most shocking aspect of his captivity was not the absence of torture but the presence of choice. In the POW camp mess hall, prisoners could select from multiple food options. This trivial detail, the ability to choose between chicken and beef, between potatoes and rice, represented a philosophical chasm. In the Imperial Army, choice was an illusion. Orders were absolute. Deviation was treason. But here, even as prisoners, even as defeated enemies, they were granted a small, symbolic autonomy. Lieutenant Sarah Brennan did not think of her work in ideological terms. She was not a propagandist or a political officer. She was a nurse, trained to assess symptoms, administer treatment, and monitor recovery. But she was also, whether she intended it or not, an ambassador of a different way of life. Her interactions with Corporal Yamamoto and other Japanese prisoners were not scripted or strategic. They were human. And it was precisely this unscripted humanity that proved most effective. In late January 1945, Corporal Yamamoto's condition improved enough for him to be transferred to a larger POW facility in Manila. Before he left, Lieutenant Brennan gave him a small gift, a pocket-sized English-Japanese dictionary. It was a battered copy, donated by a Red Cross volunteer, with pencil marks in the margins and a torn cover. It was not much, but to Corporal Yamamoto it was significant. It suggested that the Americans believed he had a future, that he would need language skills, that his life extended beyond this moment. He took the dictionary and bowed, a gesture that surprised both of them, a reflexive return to formality, to the rituals of respect that had been drilled into him since childhood. Lieutenant Brennan returned the bow, inexpertly but sincerely. She had learned over months of treating Japanese prisoners that small gestures of cultural respect mattered. They did not erase the war. They did not negate the suffering, but they acknowledged a shared humanity that transcended nationalism. When Corporal Yamamoto left the field hospital, escorted by 2 American military police officers, he looked back once. Lieutenant Brennan was standing in the tent entrance, her uniform wrinkled, her face tired, watching him go. He would later tell interviewers that this image stayed with him for the rest of his life. An American woman, an enemy, who had treated him with more kindness than his own officers ever had. The broader impact of such interactions is difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. By the end of the war, the United States held approximately 41,000 Japanese prisoners of war. The vast majority were captured in the final year of the conflict, as Japanese forces collapsed across the Pacific. These prisoners returned to Japan after the war carrying stories that contradicted official propaganda. They spoke of adequate food, medical care, and most subversively, respect. Their testimonies contributed to a broader disillusionment with militarism in post-war Japan. Many former POWs became advocates for democracy, education reform, and reconciliation with the West. Some became teachers, journalists, and politicians, shaping the reconstruction of Japanese society in ways both subtle and profound. Corporal Takeshi Yamamoto was one of them. After repatriation in late 1946, he returned to Hokkaido and resumed his studies. He became a school teacher, as he had planned before the war, specializing in English language instruction. He married, raised 3 children, and lived until 2003. In interviews conducted in the 1980s as part of an oral history project, he spoke openly about his captivity. He described the moment he realized that American propaganda about Japanese cruelty was false, but also the moment he realized that Japanese propaganda about American cruelty was equally false. "I was taught that surrender meant death," he said, "but I surrendered and I lived. I was taught that Americans were savages, but they healed me. I was taught that the emperor was divine, but no divine authority would have sent me to die for a lie." He kept the dictionary. It sat on his desk for 57 years, its pages yellowed, its spine cracked. He never met Lieutenant Sarah Brennan again. He did not know if she survived the war, if she returned to Boston, if she ever thought about the Japanese corporal she had treated in a field hospital in January 1945. But he thought about her often. In his classroom, he told his students that language was a bridge, that understanding began with the willingness to listen, and that even in war, even between enemies, humanity could survive if someone chose to honor it. He never mentioned her by name. He had never learned it, but he described her actions, and his students listened. The story of Japanese prisoners and American nurses is not a simple narrative of redemption. It does not erase the atrocities committed by the Imperial Japanese Army across Asia and the Pacific. It does not minimize the suffering of Allied prisoners in Japanese custody, many of whom were starved, beaten, and worked to death in conditions that violated every principle of international law. The treatment Japanese POWs received in American hands was not universal. There were incidents of abuse, neglect, and racism. But the overall pattern is clear and documented. The United States, despite the intensity of the Pacific War, despite the racial animosity that pervaded American society in the 1940s, despite the strategic logic that might have justified harsher treatment, chose to adhere to the Geneva Convention. And that choice, implemented by thousands of medics, doctors, and nurses across the Pacific theater, had consequences that extended far beyond the battlefield. The nurses themselves rarely spoke of their work in heroic terms. In interviews conducted decades later, many described their treatment of Japanese prisoners as simply doing their job. Lieutenant Brennan, in a 1982 interview with a Veterans History Project, said, "We didn't think of them as Japanese or American. We thought of them as patients. That was all. You see a wounded man, you treat him. That's what we were trained to do." But this professionalism, this refusal to see the enemy as less than human, was itself a radical act. It was a repudiation of the dehumanization that war demands, a quiet insistence that ethical principles could survive even in extremity. The symbolic power of the nurse, female, compassionate, skilled, played a unique role in this dynamic. In Japanese culture, women were associated with domestic life, motherhood, and caregiving. The presence of American women in military roles challenged Japanese assumptions about Western decadence and gender relations. It suggested a society in which women could be educated, professional, and autonomous, a stark contrast to the rigid gender hierarchies of Imperial Japan. For many Japanese prisoners, the kindness of American nurses was not merely personal but systemic. It reflected a society that valued education, individual rights, and the rule of law. It reflected, in other words, democracy. This connection between treatment and ideology was not lost on American military planners. By 1944, the U.S. military had developed a sophisticated psychological operations strategy aimed at encouraging Japanese surrender. Leaflets, radio broadcasts, and loudspeaker announcements emphasized that prisoners would be treated humanely, that they would receive medical care, food, and protection. These messages were often dismissed as propaganda by Japanese soldiers, but when prisoners returned to their units, either through escape or release after interrogation, and confirmed that the promises were true, the impact was significant. Surrender rates increased, particularly in the final months of the war, as Japanese soldiers faced starvation, disease, and the certainty of defeat. The ethical question remains: was humane treatment a moral imperative or a strategic tool? The answer almost certainly is both. American adherence to the Geneva Convention was rooted in legal and ethical principles that predated World War II, but it was also tactically advantageous. Prisoners who were treated well were more likely to cooperate, to provide intelligence, and to serve as examples to other Japanese soldiers still in the field. The U.S. military understood this. But understanding the strategic value of ethics does not diminish the ethics themselves. The fact that humane treatment served American interests does not mean it was insincere or cynical. It means, rather, that the values embedded in democratic societies, respect for human dignity, rule of law, individual rights, can be both morally sound and practically effective. In the spring of 1945, as the war in the Pacific entered its final, brutal phase, the field hospital where Lieutenant Brennan worked treated hundreds of Japanese prisoners. Some were cooperative, some were hostile, some were so traumatized that they could not speak or eat, but all of them, without exception, received the same standard of care as American soldiers. This was not sentimentality. It was policy. It was law. And it was, in its own way, a form of ideological warfare more powerful than any bomb or bullet. The recurring symbol in all these stories is the meal. Not the grand feast, but the simple tray of food delivered 3 times a day, without fanfare, without condition. To the Japanese prisoners, this daily ritual became a kind of sacrament, a physical manifestation of a philosophy they had been taught to despise. The imperial ideology promised glory through sacrifice, immortality through death, and honor through obedience. The American system promised something less transcendent but more tangible: survival, dignity, and the possibility of a future. For young men like Corporal Yamamoto, starving in the jungle, watching their comrades die of disease and despair, the choice between these two philosophies was not abstract. It was embodied in the weight of a metal tray, the smell of canned peaches, the taste of coffee. It was embodied in the hands of a woman who, despite everything, treated them as if their lives mattered. Lieutenant Brennan left the Pacific in August 1945 after the Japanese surrender. She returned to Boston, resumed her nursing career, and rarely spoke publicly about her wartime service. In private letters to fellow nurses, she described the work as exhausting, heartbreaking, and occasionally rewarding. She never claimed to have changed anyone's mind or saved anyone's soul. She simply did her job. But her job, and the jobs of thousands like her, contributed to one of the most significant and least discussed aspects of the Pacific War: the transformation of Japanese prisoners from indoctrinated soldiers into individuals capable of questioning the ideology that had defined their lives. This transformation was not universal. Some Japanese prisoners never accepted their captivity, never reconciled themselves to survival, and returned to Japan after the war still believing in the righteousness of their cause. But many did change, and their stories, passed down through families, recorded in oral histories and studied by historians, reveal a truth that transcends any single conflict: that ideology, no matter how deeply rooted, can be shaken by lived experience. That propaganda, no matter how persuasive, cannot survive sustained contact with contradictory evidence. And that kindness, even in war, even between enemies, is a force more subversive than violence. Decades after the war, a Japanese documentary crew traveled to the United States to interview American nurses who had served in the Pacific Theater. They found Lieutenant Sarah Brennan in a nursing home outside Boston, elderly but lucid, willing to talk. The interviewer asked her if she remembered treating Japanese prisoners. She said she did. He asked if she remembered any of them specifically. She hesitated, then said, "There was a young corporal, shattered leg, wouldn't eat for days. I don't remember his name." The interviewer told her that his name was Takeshi Yamamoto, that he had become a teacher, that he had spoken of her many times, that he had credited her with saving not just his life but his humanity. Lieutenant Brennan was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "I hope he lived a good life. I hope they all did." The interviewer asked one final question. Why did you treat them with such care, knowing what the Japanese army had done, knowing that they were the enemy? Lieutenant Brennan looked out the window of the nursing home, toward the gray Atlantic coast, and said, "Because someone had to remember that they were boys, just boys. And boys don't stop being human just because someone hands them a rifle and tells them to hate." She died 6 months later in 2004 at the age of 85. Her obituary in the Boston Globe mentioned her military service, but did not detail her work with Japanese prisoners. That story remained largely unknown, buried in military archives and the fading memories of men like Corporal Yamamoto, who had long since passed. But the story endures, not because it is unique, but because it is representative. Across the Pacific, in field hospitals and POW camps, in moments of crisis and exhaustion, American nurses made a choice. They chose to see the enemy as human. They chose to honor their professional ethics over the demands of hatred. And in doing so, they demonstrated a truth that every democracy must learn and relearn with each generation. That the measure of a society is not how it treats its heroes, but how it treats its defeated enemies. That strength is not the absence of mercy, but the courage to extend it. And that the most powerful weapon in any ideological conflict is not the capacity to destroy, but the willingness to heal. The war ended. The prisoners went home. The nurses returned to civilian life. The tents were dismantled, the field hospitals closed, the records filed away in archives where few would ever read them. But the impact of those moments, the tray of food, the clean bandage, the quiet reassurance, rippled forward through time. It rippled through the lives of men like Corporal Yamamoto, who became teachers and fathers and citizens of a rebuilt, democratic Japan. It rippled through the post-war reconciliation between former enemies, through the alliances and trade agreements and cultural exchanges that followed. It rippled through the children and grandchildren of those prisoners, who grew up in a Japan that bore little resemblance to the militaristic empire of 1945. A Japan shaped in part by the testimony of men who had seen, in their darkest hour, that the enemy they had been taught to hate was capable of unexpected grace. And so the story closes not with triumph or tragedy, but with a quieter truth, that in the machinery of war, in the vast impersonal logistics of armies and battles and campaigns, there were still moments when individual choice mattered, when one person, acting not from strategy or propaganda but from simple human decency, could alter the course of another's life. When a nurse in a canvas tent could become, for one wounded soldier, the evidence that everything he had been taught was wrong. And when that evidence, repeated across thousands of interactions, in hundreds of field hospitals, over months and years, could contribute in ways both subtle and profound to the dismantling of an ideology and the rebuilding of a nation. That is the legacy, not perfect, not unblemished, but real, the legacy of hands that healed rather than harmed, the legacy of meals served without condition, the legacy of women who refused to dehumanize, even when dehumanization would have been easier, safer, more consistent with the hatreds of their time. It is a legacy written not in grand declarations or monuments, but in the survival of men who expected death and received care. In the memories of soldiers who learned in the worst moment of their lives that kindness is not weakness, that mercy is not betrayal, and that the promise of democracy, imperfect, flawed, but genuine, is not merely the right to be free, but the obligation to recognize freedom in others, even in those who have been taught to deny it, even in those who have fought to destroy it, even in enemies, even in war, even then.